The Greenwood Archer in Lincoln Green is a famous English legend. What if that famous story is almost entirely a fiction? We are going to peel back the layers of ballad, myth, and Hollywood glamour. Our mission is to hunt for the real people and gritty events that may have inspired the tale of Robin Hood. By the end, you will know whether a single heroic outlaw ever truly drew his bow in Sherwood Forest. We will sift through dusty court rolls, meet suspicious fugitives, and question why a story set in Nottingham might have been born in the wilds of Yorkshire. This is a journey into the heart of a historical mystery. What does a hero look like when you strip away the fairy tale? The legend of Robin Hood carries a cultural weight few stories can match. But to find its origins, we must first understand how it was built layer by layer over centuries. Our first solid clue appears not in a forest but in a poem. In the year 1377, the writer William Langland penned a work called Piers Plowman. In it, a lazy priest confesses he knows the rhymes of Robin Hood better than his own prayers. This single offhand mention tells us something vital. By the late 14th century, stories of Robin were already common, popular enough to be a distracting pastime. They were part of an oral tradition, sung or recited in taverns and at fairs long before they were ever written down. These early tales were not the grand epic we know. They were likely short, punchy ballads about a clever yeoman, a common man, outwitting greedy authorities in the greenwood. The character was more rough and dready brawler than chivalrous hero. The transformation began in earnest with the invention of the printing press. By the 15th and 16th centuries, cheap printed sheets called broadside ballads spread the stories far and wide. This is where the legend truly started to evolve. To appeal to a broader audience, including the gentry, storytellers began to elevate Robin's status. The simple yeoman gradually gained a tragic backstory, becoming Robin of Loxley, a dispossessed nobleman wronged by a corrupt sheriff. This added a layer of righteous injustice that resonated deeply. Each new era then molded Robin in its own image. In the 19th century, Sir Walter Scott's novel Ivanhoe cemented Robin, or rather his stand in Loxley, as a patriotic Saxon hero resisting the Norman oppressors, an idea that spoke to Victorian notions of national identity. Then came Hollywood. Errol Flynn's dazzling, swashbuckling portrayal in the 1930s gave us the definitive charming rogue, all laughter and daring acrobatics. Decades later, Kevin Costner's more somber, romantic take emphasized the love story with Maid Marian and a gritty, earthy realism. Every adaptation from the ballads to the blockbusters added a piece to the puzzle. They gifted him with new companions, refined his mission, and polished his motives. What we have today is not a single ancient story, but a magnificent composite. A hero carefully crafted and reshaped to fit the dreams and anxieties of every generation that told his tale. But if the legend is a composite stitched together over centuries, where do we even begin looking for a real person? Perhaps we should start with the name itself. What does Robin Hood actually mean? On the surface, it seems straightforward, a simple first name and a last name. Yet both parts of this iconic alias are shrouded in their own intriguing mist. Let us start with Robin. In medieval England, Robin was a very common nickname for Robert. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of Rob or Bobby. It was a name for everyman, not for a noble. So from the very beginning, the name plants our hero firmly among the common people. Then there is Hood. This is where it gets really interesting. A hood, of course, is a piece of clothing, a simple head covering. But in the context of medieval law, it carried a specific meaning. An outlaw, someone declared outside the protection of the law, was often described as wearing a hood or a cap to conceal his identity. The term hood could literally mean a criminal, so Robin Hood could simply translate to rob the outlaw, but there is another layer. A hood was also practical woodland attire for a forester, someone who worked in or lived off the forest. So the name might not have originally marked a vicious criminal, but rather a woodsman, someone who operated on the fringes of society. This ambiguity opens the door to a fascinating theory. What if Robin Hood was not a single person's name at all, but a type of person or even a generic nickname? Much like we might call an unknown man John Doe today, Robin Hood could have been a placeholder name for any anonymous outlaw in popular ballads. The stories were not about one specific Robert from Loxley. They were about the idea of the clever, resourceful outlaw in the Greenwood, and they gave him a common, catchy name to hang the tales on. Evidence for this idea comes from historical records that are startlingly mundane. In the 13th century, decades before the first known ballads, court rolls from southern England list surnames like Robert Hod and Robert Hod. In one case from the year 1244, a man named William Robert Hod is mentioned, and by 1261 the surname Robert Hod appears again, this time attached to a man who was quite fittingly a fugitive. These were not legendary figures, they were ordinary people, perhaps ancestors who once had a reputation for being difficult or who simply lived in the woods. The name had become a family name derived from a nickname. This complicates the search immensely. If Robin Hood was a generic term or a common nickname that evolved into a surname, then finding the real Robin Hood is like searching for the original John Doe. The name points us not to a single shining hero, but to a whole world of restless men living on the edge of the law, men whose real lives might have provided the gritty raw material for 100 different stories. Among these restless men living in the shadows of the law, one name in an old court record stands out with startling clarity. In the year 1226 in the county of Yorkshire, a clerk penned a brief entry into the assize rolls. It states that a man named Robert Hod, a fugitive, owed a debt of 32 shillings and 6 pence to the treasury of St. Peter's in York. And with that dry, administrative note, we meet our first serious candidate for the real Robin Hood. This was not a ballad or a story, this was a legal record. The timing is crucial. 1226 was just 1 year after the death of the infamous King John, a period of immense social and political turmoil. The country was still reeling from the Barons' Wars, a conflict over the Magna Carta, and the rule of law was shaky at best. In this chaotic environment, a man could easily find himself on the wrong side of authority. So what do we know about this Robert Hod? The record is frustratingly sparse. It tells us he was a fugitive, meaning he was a wanted man who had fled to avoid the law. His crime was likely debt or perhaps a petty theft that led to his outlawry. He was not a nobleman but a commoner, a man of little means who found himself crushed by a system that favored the wealthy and the powerful. Historians are drawn to him for two compelling reasons. First, the name is a perfect match. Robert Hod is phonetically Robin Hood. In the dialects of the time, the names would have sounded virtually identical. Second, the date is remarkably early, predating the first literary reference by over a century and a half. This places a real outlaw with the right name in the right historical context, a man living in the Greenwoods of Yorkshire, not Nottinghamshire, a full century before the ballads began to circulate. Yet we must pause and ask a difficult question. Was Robert Hod's story grand enough to birth a legend? The record suggests a mundane, tragic reality. He was not robbing the rich to feed the poor. He was a debtor on the run, a man trying to survive. His story was one of desperation, not daring heroism. It is entirely possible that his name, Robert Hod the Fugitive, simply lingered in local memory. Over decades, as minstrels and storytellers passed through Yorkshire, they might have heard the name and attached it to older, more exciting tales of woodland outlaws. The name provided an anchor, a believable detail, while the deeds were amplified by imagination. So we are left with a tantalizing possibility. The real Robin Hood may have begun as a man named Robert who owed money to a church and who chose the freedom of the forest over the confines of a debtor's prison. His legacy was not a golden arrow, but a name that would, centuries later, be sung about in taverns and etched onto the heart of England itself. The world Robert Hod vanished into was one of deep, ancient woodland and harsh, unforgiving law. In the early 13th century, much of Yorkshire was still a vast, untamed forest, not just clusters of trees, but a legally defined royal territory. These forests were the king's private hunting grounds, governed by a separate and notoriously oppressive set of laws known as the forest law. Ordinary people living within these zones faced severe restrictions. They could not hunt deer, nor even gather firewood or let their pigs forage without permission from the king's foresters. The penalty for poaching a deer was not a fine, but blinding or execution. This created a permanent state of tension between the local populace and the crown officials who enforced these draconian rules. A forester was not a friendly park ranger. He was often a feared and resented authority figure, armed with the power to ruin lives over a single fallen branch or a trapped rabbit. This is the volatile landscape Robert Hod navigated. His flight in 1226 came at a uniquely turbulent moment. Just 1 year earlier, King John, the architect of much of this harsh governance, had died. His reign had been marked by exorbitant taxes, cruel punishments, and a bitter civil war with his own barons that culminated in the sealing of the Magna Carta. Though that great charter is remembered for establishing principles of justice, its immediate aftermath was chaos. The country was fractured, the authority of the new boy king, Henry III, was weak, and local power struggles were rampant. In this climate, the lines between criminal and rebel, between fugitive and freedom fighter, could blur dramatically. So what might have pushed Robert Hod across that line? The record states he owed money to a church treasury. Debt was a crushing burden for medieval commoners. A bad harvest, an illness in the family, or a sudden tax demand could plunge a man into insolvency. Faced with a debt he could not pay, Hod's choices were grim. He could submit to debtor's prison, a virtual death sentence, or he could attempt to work it off in indentured servitude, losing his freedom for years. Or he could choose the greenwood. Outlawry was a desperate form of protest. By fleeing into the forest, a man placed himself outside the king's peace. He was declared a wolf's head, meaning anyone could kill him on sight without legal consequence. But in the dense woods of Yorkshire, a skilled man could disappear. He could live off the land, poach the king's deer, and perhaps even band together with other desperate souls. There is no evidence this particular Robert Hod robbed from the rich to give to the poor, or that he ever clashed with a Sheriff of Nottingham. His story is likely far more ordinary and in its own way more telling. He was probably a man cornered by poverty and a rigid legal system who chose the perilous freedom of the outlaw over submission. His legacy is not in legendary deeds, but in his name echoing through time, a whisper of the countless anonymous men who, when pressed by an unjust world, simply melted into the trees and became a story waiting to be told. While Robert Hod represents a gritty, plausible origin, another candidate captures the romantic heart of the legend. This is Robin of Loxley, the dispossessed nobleman. Unlike the fugitive debtor from Yorkshire, this Robin is a figure of high drama, a gentleman unjustly stripped of his title and lands, forced into the greenwood to become an outlaw king. This version, however, is a much later invention. It does not appear in the earliest ballads where Robin is firmly a yeoman. The elevation to nobility began in the 17th century as printed broadsides sought to appeal to a wealthier, more literate audience. A story about a wronged lord fighting for justice had a different, more refined appeal than a tale of a common brawler. The transformation was cemented by Sir Walter Scott's 1819 novel Ivanhoe. In its pages, Robin, under the name Loxley, is portrayed as a staunch Saxon patriot, a skilled archer leading a band of free men against their Norman oppressors. This single literary act tied the legend forever to the centuries-old conflict between Saxon and Norman. giving Robin a grand, nationalistic cause that resonated powerfully in the Victorian era. It provided a perfect backstory, a reason for his exile that was noble, pardonable, and deeply sympathetic. But where was Loxley? The name itself is a point of fierce and quite telling debate. Several villages claim the title. There is a Loxley in South Yorkshire near Sheffield and another potential site in Nottinghamshire. Local legends in both areas proudly point to ancient wells, crumbling foundations, or specific fields as proof that their Loxley is the true one. This geographical tug-of-war reveals less about history and more about the power of the story itself. Communities wanted and still want to claim a piece of this iconic hero. The archetype of the dispossessed nobleman serves a crucial narrative function. It transforms Robin from a common criminal into a tragic hero. His mission is no longer just about survival or wealth redistribution. It is about restoring a stolen birthright and correcting a profound injustice. This framework allowed the legend to absorb deeper political and social commentaries. It spoke to anxieties about corrupt authority, the fragility of land ownership, and the idea that true nobility is found in action, not just in bloodline. Yet, for all its narrative power, this version has the shakiest historical footing. There are no contemporary records of a Lord Robin of Loxley losing his lands in the 12th or 13th centuries. The Saxon versus Norman conflict, while a real and brutal period, was largely over by the time the Robin Hood ballads first emerged. This Robin is a literary creation, a character molded to fit the preoccupations of a later age. He is not a man we can find in a court role, but a reflection of what audiences centuries later wanted their hero to be, a champion with a cause as grand as his skill with a bow. The search for a noble Robin Hood leads us to a crumbling tombstone and a story of wishful thinking. In the 16th century, as the legend's popularity soared, antiquarians became obsessed with finding proof of Robin's historical existence. Their most tantalizing discovery came at Kirklees Priory in Yorkshire, where a weathered grave was said to mark the final resting place of the outlaw. According to local tradition and a few eager scholars, the inscription read, "Here lies Robert, Earl of Huntington, none there was so famously good." The date given was 1247. This seemed like a monumental breakthrough. Here was a noble Robin, an earl no less, with a death date firmly in the 13th century, the perfect candidate for the real man behind the myth. The title Earl of Huntington provided the aristocratic pedigree that the newer, more refined versions of the story craved. It transformed Robin from a possibly common criminal into a tragic figure of high birth, giving his rebellion a layer of lost nobility that resonated with Elizabethan and later audiences. The discovery was eagerly seized upon, cited for centuries as the long-sought historical anchor for the legend. But there is a profound problem with this elegant solution. Nearly every aspect of the Kirklees tombstone is suspect. First, the inscription itself. The earliest reliable reports of it come from the 1500s, a full 3 centuries after the date it claims. The style of the lettering and the phrasing were likely a later fabrication, carved by someone who wanted to create a tourist attraction or lend physical legitimacy to the local folklore. Second, the dates create a jarring mismatch. If this Robert died in 1247, he lived during the reign of Henry III, a period of relative stability following the chaos of King John's reign. This does not align with the traditional setting of the ballads, which often place Robin in the time of a King Richard and a Prince John, a period decades earlier. There is no historical record of a Robert, Earl of Huntington, who was an outlaw or who died under mysterious circumstances in 1247. The real Earls of Huntington were powerful magnates, their lives well documented in charters and chronicles, and none of them match the profile of a Greenwood bandit. So what does this elaborate but likely false grave tell us? It is a powerful example of retrofitting. As the legend grew in cultural importance, people naturally wanted to ground it in reality. Finding a tombstone with a vaguely correct name and a plausible date was too tempting to ignore. It allowed scholars and storytellers to graft the beloved folk hero onto a real aristocratic lineage, laundering his outlaw status through the respectability of a title. This was not history uncovering a legend, but a legend rewriting history to suit its own needs. The Earl of Huntingdon represents not a discovered truth, but a collective desire for one, a centuries-old attempt to build a noble pedestal for a hero who may have always been at heart a man of the people. Yet every hero needs a villain worthy of the legend. For Robin Hood, that figure is the Sheriff of Nottingham, often portrayed as a greedy, bumbling aristocrat in a fancy robe. But the real sheriff was no cartoon character. He was the sharp, unforgiving edge of royal power, and understanding his role is key to unlocking the conflict at the heart of the story. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire was not merely a local lawman. He was the king's personal representative in the county, a combination of chief executive, head tax collector, and principal judge. His primary duty was not to fight crime as we think of it, but to collect the king's revenues and maintain order with an iron fist. Every penny of royal rent, every fine from the forest courts, and every unpopular tax passed through his hands before being sent to the treasury. This made him, by the very nature of his job, the most resented man in the region. He was not elected by the people, he was appointed by the king, often as a reward for loyal service, and he was expected to turn a profit from his position. This system was a recipe for corruption and brutality. Now consider a specific historical sheriff who perfectly embodies this oppressive role. Under the reign of King John, a man named Philip Mark served as Sheriff of Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as a foreign mercenary, a creature of the king known for his cruelty. He used his authority to seize property, extort money, and imprison locals on flimsy charges. He was so hated that his name actually appears in a later version of the Magna Carta, where the barons demanded his removal from office. Here was a real, documented figure whose tyranny was felt across the countryside. Imagine being a farmer or a forester under his rule. A bad harvest means you cannot pay your rent. The sheriff's men arrive not with understanding but with a warrant. They might take your grain, your livestock, or even claim your land. You have no recourse, no local council to appeal to. The sheriff is the law. This is the essential historical tension that breathes life into the Robin Hood ballads. The stories are not really about a man who steals from the rich. They are about a man who steals from the sheriff. He is targeting the embodiment of a remote, extractive, and often cruel system. When Robin ambushes the sheriff's tax collectors on the road through Sherwood, he is performing a fantasy of retribution for every common person who ever felt crushed by an unfair fine or an impossible demand. The sheriff, in his fancy robes, riding with his armed guards, represents everything that is distant, powerful, and uncaring about authority. Robin, in his homespun green, hiding among the trees he knows so well, represents local knowledge, cunning, and resistance. This conflict is not medieval, it is timeless. It is the struggle of the individual against an impersonal system, the community against the crown, the have-nots against the relentless taxman. The sheriff gives the outlaws' rebellion a face, a name, and a castle to storm. Without this very real, very powerful office of royal enforcement, the legend of Robin Hood would have no heat, no fire, and no enduring reason to be told. The sheriff's power reached its peak in the shadow of the trees. Sherwood Forest was far more than a scenic backdrop for daring escapes. It was a vast managed territory, a royal forest, and that word carried the weight of law. This was not a public park or a simple expanse of wilderness. It was the king's private hunting preserve, and its true purpose created the perfect conditions for an outlaw to thrive. The entire ecosystem, from the oldest oak to the youngest fawn, existed first and foremost for the pleasure of the monarch. This privilege was enforced by the brutal forest law. For the common people living in and around Sherwood, these laws were a daily source of grievance. You could not hunt the deer, of course, but the restrictions went much further. You needed special permission to cut wood for your hearth or to repair your cottage. Letting your pigs forage for acorns, a vital practice known as pannage, could bring a heavy fine if done without approval. Even ploughing a new field on the forest's edge might be seen as an encroachment on the king's land. The penalty for breaking these rules was severe, ranging from crippling fines to mutilation or death for poaching a royal stag. This created a permanent, simmering resentment. The forest, which should have been a source of sustenance, became a symbol of exclusion and oppression. It was a green hell for those trapped by its rules, but for someone who chose to live outside them, it offered something invaluable: refuge. The geography of Sherwood was a natural fortress. It was not a uniform blanket of trees, but a mosaic of landscapes. Dense, ancient oak woodlands provided deep cover. Open heathlands offered long sightlines to spot approaching riders. Impenetrable thickets of holly and thorn formed natural barriers. Scattered within were isolated hamlets and forest lodges, places where a fugitive might find a meal or a whispered warning in exchange for a coin or a favor. This complex terrain was a world apart from the ordered fields and manors, a shadow realm where the king's writ grew faint, and Sherwood was not unique. Forests like Barnsdale in Yorkshire, the New Forest in the south, and the Great Weald of Kent all served as similar zones of lawlessness. They were the hideouts for generations of desperate men, from the legendary Hereward the Wake to the real-life gangs of the 14th century. These were the highways and safe houses of the medieval underworld, so when the ballads placed Robin in Sherwood, they were tapping into a very real geography of resistance. The forest was the character that made the legend possible. It was the mother of outlaws, a place where the rules of society dissolved, and where a man with a bow and a grudge against the sheriff could become not just a criminal but a king of the Greenwood. This shadowy brotherhood in the Greenwood raises a crucial question. Who were the merry men really? The ballads give us a colorful cast, a loyal fellowship bound by honor and a shared cause. But the historical reality of medieval outlaw gangs was far grittier, born less from idealism and more from sheer desperation. In the harsh world of the 13th and 14th centuries, the forests were not just hiding places for lone fugitives. They became the bases for entire communities of the dispossessed. These gangs were often a mix of the desperate and the dangerous. You might find a peasant who had lost his land after a failed harvest, a former soldier left unpaid and adrift after a war, a runaway serf seeking freedom from his lord, or a petty thief escaping the gallows. Their bond was not friendship but mutual survival. They pooled their skills, one man good with a bow, another who knew the hidden paths, a third who could sell stolen goods in a distant market. This was a pragmatic, often brutal, business arrangement. For a vivid, real-world parallel, we need only look at the infamous gangs that terrorized the English countryside in the early 1300s. Take the Falville family. Led by Eustace Falville and his brothers, they were landed gentry who turned to organized crime. They kidnapped judges, extorted money, and murdered a corrupt royal official, essentially operating as a well-connected mafia. Then there was the Cottrell gang, led by James Cottrell, a former soldier. His band included clerics and even local landowners who provided safe houses. These were not romantic rebels, they were violent entrepreneurs exploiting the weak central authority to build their own power bases. Yet, here is the fascinating twist that connects them to our legend. These ruthless gangs sometimes gained a strange measure of local support. How? Because they often targeted the very people the common folk despised, like overzealous tax collectors, corrupt abbots, or hated landlords. When the Falvilles killed a notoriously oppressive royal justice named Sir Roger Bellers, they were seen by many not as murderers but as deliverers of rough justice. The same system that crushed the peasant also created these outlaw aristocrats, and in the public eye, the enemy of my enemy could start to look like a folk hero. This is the social alchemy that transforms a criminal gang into the merry men. Over time, through song and story, the gritty details of extortion and violence are scrubbed away. The diverse band of cutthroats becomes a band of brothers. Their selfish struggle for survival is recast as a principled rebellion. The local support they sometimes cultivated through fear or favor hardens into legendary popularity. So the merry men are not a complete fiction. They are a polished, sentimental reflection of a much darker truth. The ballads took the real, frightening phenomenon of the outlaw brotherhood and gave it a heart, a code, and a cheerful song to sing around the campfire, turning a story of survival into a lasting dream of fellowship and resistance. The Brotherhood of the Greenwood was not always complete. Two of its most famous members, the gentle maid Marian and the jovial friar Tuck, were nowhere to be found in the earliest outlaw ballads. They arrived centuries later, not from the grim world of forest lore, but from the vibrant, chaotic world of popular festival. Their inclusion transformed the story from a simple adventure into a richer tapestry of romance and social commentary. Let us begin with Marian. In the oldest surviving tales, there is no love interest, no lady-in-waiting. Robin Hood's world is one of masculine camaraderie and conflict. So where did she come from? Marian first appears not in a written story, but as a character in the May games and springtime folk plays of the 15th and 16th centuries. These were boisterous community celebrations marking the end of winter, full of dancing, music, and symbolic plays. In them, Marian was often a personification of the spring itself, a May Queen figure, sometimes paired with a Robin character who represented the fertile, green spirit of the forest. Over time, as these festive traditions began to merge with the popular outlaw ballads, the two Robins blurred into one. The springtime consort became the outlaw's sweetheart. This explains her somewhat fluid role in early versions. She is less a damsel in distress and more a capable, independent figure who could hold her own in the greenwood, a fitting companion for a king of outlaws. Her addition gave the legend a crucial new dimension, humanizing Robin and introducing the timeless element of romance, making the stories appealing to a wider audience. Then there is Friar Tuck. He makes his literary debut in a 15th century manuscript called The Play of Robin Hood, a short, comedic piece meant for performance. He is not a pious cleric but a fighting friar fond of his food and ale, who joins the band after a vigorous and hilarious quarterstaff battle with Robin himself. This character served a brilliant satirical purpose. The medieval church was a vast, wealthy, and often deeply corrupt institution. Friars, in particular, were frequently satirized for being greedy, lazy, and hypocritical, wandering the countryside begging for alms while living quite well. A friar who abandons his order to live with outlaws, who blesses their stolen feasts and uses his religious authority to mock the very system that created him, was a delicious piece of social critique. He allowed the stories to poke fun at ecclesiastical corruption in a way that was safe, because it was just a play, just a story. But here, history offers a tantalizing echo. In the year 1417, legal records from Sussex mention a man known as Friar Tuck. He was described as a leader of a violent gang, a chaplain who had been outlawed for his crimes. This was not a character in a play. This was a real, troublesome priest living in the forests. It is possible that the nickname Friar Tuck was already in use as a generic alias for an outlaw cleric, and the playwright simply borrowed it, or that the real friar's notoriety inspired the fictional one. Either way, his inclusion completed the Merry Men as a microcosm of medieval society, a nobleman in exile, a yeoman, a miller's son, and now a representative of the powerful church, all united in rebellion against a common, oppressive world. Marian and Tuck show us the legend breathing and growing, absorbing new characters from the fertile soil of popular culture to reflect deeper human desires for love, laughter, and a little righteous impiety. The longbow was not a weapon of chivalry but of the common man. For a fugitive in the greenwood, it was far more than a tool for hunting. It was the great equalizer. In the hands of a skilled archer, this simple piece of yew wood and hemp string could punch through the finest plate armor at over 200 yards, a terrifying fact that reshaped medieval warfare. This power came at a steep personal cost. To draw a war bow with a pull weight of 100 pounds or more required immense specific strength built from childhood. The skeletons of medieval archers often showed telltale deformities, enlarged left arms and twisted spines, a permanent physical testament to their craft. This was the weapon of the yeoman, the free commoner, not the knight on his expensive horse. Its legendary status was cemented on battlefields like Crecy in 1346, where waves of English and Welsh longbowmen decimated the flower of French nobility. In that moment, the bow became a potent symbol of national identity, a tool through which a common man could defy the social order and strike down his betters. It is no wonder that the ballads seized upon it. Making Robin a master bowman was not just about giving him a skill, it was about giving him a democratic power, a means to challenge authority from a distance. Survival in the forest demanded a far broader set of skills than just archery. A real outlaw needed to be a master forester. He had to read the landscape like a map, knowing which streams were clean, which hollow oaks offered dry shelter, and which paths were safe from the sheriff's patrols. He would understand animal behavior not for sport but for sustenance, setting subtle snares for rabbits and knowing how to field dress a deer without wasting a scrap. Knowledge of herbal medicine was essential. A wound from a thorn, a bout of fever, or a poisoned arrowhead required treatment, and the greenwood itself was the pharmacy. He might use yarrow to staunch bleeding, willow bark for pain, or honey to dress a wound. These were the practical, unglamorous arts of staying alive, passed down through generations of woodsmen, poachers, and hermits. This grounding in material reality helps us separate the plausible outlaw from the mythical hero. A real Robert Hod could certainly have been a competent bowman, using his skill to put venison in the pot and to defend his camp from foresters. But the legendary feats, like splitting his opponent's arrow in the famous archery contest, belong firmly to the realm of folklore. They are narrative miracles designed to showcase a hero's supernatural talent and divine favor. The truth is likely more humble and, in its own way, more impressive. The longbow and the deep knowledge of the forest were not gifts, they were hard-won tools of resilience. They represent the tangible, gritty reality of a life lived deliberately outside the law, a life of constant adaptation where every meal, every warm night, and every avoided capture was a victory earned by skill and grit. But a bow and woodland skills are only half the story. The other half is the broken world that forced a man to use them. To understand why the legend took root and thrived, we must step out of the forest and into the halls of power, into a century defined by absent kings, crushing taxes, and civil war. This is the political petri dish that cultivated heroes of the greenwood. The traditional setting of the Robin Hood ballads is the late 12th century, during the reign of King Richard the Lionheart and the misrule of his brother, Prince John. While the earliest historical candidates like Robert Hod appear later, this narrative backdrop is powerfully symbolic. Richard spent almost his entire 10-year reign abroad, first on the Third Crusade and then held for ransom in Austria. His absence created a dangerous power vacuum. In his place, Prince John and his officials ruled with a heavy hand, imposing extortionate taxes to fund Richard's wars and his colossal ransom of 150,000 marks. For the common people, this meant scutage, a tax on knights' fees that trickled down to crush the peasantry, and tallage, arbitrary taxes on towns and royal land. The government was seen not as a protector but as an extractive machine. This era cemented in the popular mind a potent formula: a good but absent king betrayed by his greedy, corrupt brother. It is a perfect framework for an outlaw's justification. Robin, in many tales, is a loyal subject of King Richard, fighting the local corruption that flourishes in the king's absence. His rebellion is not against the crown itself, but against its corrupted agents. Then comes King John's own reign from 1199 to 1216. If Richard was the absent idol, John was the present nightmare. His rule was a masterclass in misgovernment. He levied taxes with unprecedented frequency, seized the property of wealthy barons on dubious charges, and sparked a brutal civil war with his own nobility. His conflict with the church led to a papal interdict, a years-long period where all church services in England ceased, creating profound spiritual anxiety. The land was rife with mercenaries, private armies, and lawless violence. This chaos culminated in 1215 when a coalition of rebellious barons forced John to seal the Magna Carta at Runnymede. That document, while a landmark for the rule of law, was in the moment a peace treaty in a civil war. Its immediate aftermath was not stability but more conflict. John died the next year, leaving a 9-year-old heir, Henry III, and a country still deeply divided. The discontent did not end with the Magna Carta. The following decade saw the Barons' Wars, a series of rebellions against Henry III's own perceived weak and wasteful rule. The most famous, led by Simon de Montfort, saw the king captured at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. These wars were not tidy affairs. They were messy, local conflicts where allegiances shifted, where marauding armies lived off the land, and where the line between a noble's retainer and a common brigand was paper-thin. This entire period, from Richard's ransom to the Barons' Wars, created the ideal conditions for outlaw legends to bloom. Central authority was repeatedly weak, contested, or outright hated. Taxation was relentless and felt unjust. The forests were full of disbanded soldiers and men displaced by war. In such a world, a local hero who could outwit a greedy sheriff, who could ambush a tax collector on the Great North Road, was not just a criminal. He was an avenger, a symbol of resistance against a system that seemed designed to grind ordinary people into the dust. The stories gave a face and a bow to that deep, widespread feeling of grievance. So while a specific Robert Hod may have lived in the 1220s, and while the ballads were written down even later, they drew their enduring power from this century-long crucible of conflict. The legend is not a history lesson, but an emotional truth, born from the very real experience of living under the shadow of a crooked crown. Yet the map of this legend holds a surprising secret. For all its fame, Sherwood Forest may be an impostor, a later stage for a story born far to the north. The earliest surviving ballads do not sing of Nottinghamshire. They point their fingers northward to the wilder, more contested landscapes of Yorkshire. In the oldest complete poem we have, A Gest of Robert Hod, Robin's primary base is not Sherwood but Barnsdale. This was a dense royal forest in South Yorkshire, a place notorious for outlaws and a key stop on the Great North Road, the perfect spot for ambushing wealthy travelers. The sheriff who pursues him is explicitly the Sheriff of Nottingham, but this feels like a narrative device, a famous name inserted for a recognizable villain, while the hero's true home lies elsewhere. This northern connection is etched into the geography itself. On the rugged North Yorkshire coast, there is a town called Robin Hood's Bay. Local legend insists the outlaw once used the hidden coves there to escape pursuing authorities by sea. More tellingly, the name appears on a sea chart from the year 1544, long before any tourist trade could invent it. Across the north, you find Robin Hood's Well, Robin Hood's Cave, and countless other landmarks, a scatter of folk memories that predate the story's southern migration. So why would a northern hero be relocated? The answer lies in politics and popularity. In the centuries after the ballads first circulated, England's cultural and publishing heart was in London. Sherwood Forest, close to the bustling Midlands and easily imagined by southern audiences, was a more convenient and nationally recognizable setting than the remote forests of Yorkshire. Making the story more central made it more universally English. but the northern origin theory offers a grittier, more plausible genesis for the legend. Barnsdale and Yorkshire in the 13th and 14th centuries were frontier zones, bitterly contested during the wars with Scotland. These were lands ravaged by Scottish raids and by the retaliatory campaigns of English kings. Local authority was often weak, and heavily armed bands, whether Scottish reivers, English border guards, or simple brigands, were a constant fact of life. In this chaotic environment, a local hero who defended the community from all comers, whether a greedy southern sheriff or a pillaging Scottish raider, would have been a powerful folk figure. The stories could have begun as tales of a northern yeoman defending his home turf, a symbol of resilience in a lawless borderland. Over time, as the ballads traveled south, the specifically northern enemies faded, replaced by the universally hated figure of the sheriff. The relocation to Sherwood was not a historical correction, but a marketing decision. It smoothed the story's rough edges for a national audience, trading a complex border hero for a simpler rebel against a single corrupt official. This shift invites a profound question. Did we take a uniquely northern story, born from the clash of steel and the struggle for home, and gently file it down into a more comfortable, more centrally located English myth? The landscape of Yorkshire, with its ancient wells and haunted bays, seems to whisper yes. The legend's end is as shrouded in mystery as its beginning, a final act steeped in betrayal and poignant symbolism. In the oldest ballads, Robin Hood does not die in a glorious last stand or fade peacefully into the greenwood. He meets his end at Kirklees Priory, bled to death by the treacherous prioress. The story goes that Robin, feeling ill and weak, sought medical treatment from his cousin, the prioress of Kirklees. Instead of healing him, she treacherously opened a vein and left him to bleed out, either for a bounty or out of pure malice. As his life faded, Robin summoned his last strength to blow his horn 3 times, calling for Little John. With his final breath, he asked his loyal friend to lift him to the window. Robin then drew his bow and fired a single arrow, instructing John to bury him wherever it landed. This final, defiant shot chose his own resting place, a last act of agency against a cruel betrayal. It is a deeply powerful and human ending for a figure of such mythic stature, reminding us that even the greatest heroes are vulnerable to deceit. The real Kirklees Priory in West Yorkshire adds a chilling layer of plausibility to this grim tale. Founded in the 12th century, it was a small, relatively poor nunnery of the Cistercian order. Historical records from the relevant period do list prioresses who governed the house, women like Elizabeth de Stainton in the mid-14th century. While there is no evidence any of them murdered a famous outlaw, the existence of the priory itself and its isolated location fits the story's geography. Monasteries and nunneries in the Middle Ages often served as hospitals and way stations for travelers, making it entirely plausible a wounded or sick man might seek refuge there. But why would a ballad cast a religious figure as the villain? This speaks directly to the strong undercurrent of anti-clerical sentiment in medieval England. The church was a vast, wealthy landowner, and its officials were often seen as corrupt, greedy, and hypocritical. Stories of monks or prioresses breaking their vows, hoarding wealth, or committing acts of violence were common in popular folklore. Casting the prioress of Kirklees as the betrayer allowed the ballad to critique the church's moral failings in a safely fictional, yet biting way. It transformed a medical treatment, the common practice of bloodletting, into an act of murder, suggesting the very institutions meant to provide sanctuary could be nests of treachery. This morbid ending serves a crucial narrative purpose beyond simple tragedy. It grounds the legend in a stark, unforgiving reality. The greenwood could offer freedom but not immortality. Loyalty among the merry men was powerful, but family ties could be fatal. The arrow choosing the burial spot is a masterstroke of folk poetry, a symbol of Robin's unbreakable connection to the land and his own defiant spirit. He determines his own fate, even in death. The story may also reflect a very specific local tradition from West Yorkshire, a piece of folklore that became grafted onto the national legend. Perhaps there was a local tale of a wounded outlaw dying at the priory, or a grave marker there that people attributed to Robin Hood. Over time, as the ballads traveled, this local story became the canonical end for the hero. It reminds us that these legends are not created in a vacuum, but are woven from countless local threads, fears, and landscapes. The death at Kirklees does not diminish Robin Hood. Instead, it completes him, transforming him from an invincible storybook character into a mortal man whose legacy was sealed not just by his life of rebellion, but by the poignant, unforgettable manner of his passing. That final, lonely arrow shot from a priory window marks the ultimate price of living outside the law. But what did it truly mean to be an outlaw in the 13th century? The term is so romanticized now, evoking images of freedom and rebellion, but its legal reality was one of the harshest sentences imaginable. To be declared an outlaw was to be erased from society itself. The official term was wolf's head, from the Latin caput gerat lupinum, meaning he shall wear a wolf's head. This was not a metaphor. It was a literal declaration that the individual was no longer a man under the king's peace, but a beast of the forest. Like a wolf, he could be hunted and killed by anyone without fear of legal consequence. His life was forfeit, and the person who ended it might even collect a bounty. This was the stark opposite of the protection the law was supposed to offer. For a medieval person, the law was a shield. It governed disputes, protected property, and offered a framework for justice, however imperfect. To be placed outside it was to be stripped naked in a dangerous world. The process of becoming an outlaw was usually a last resort of the legal system. If a person accused of a serious crime like murder, robbery, or poaching the king's deer failed to appear in court after being summoned 4 times, the judge could pronounce the sentence of outlawry. It was a punishment for contempt of the court's authority as much as for the original crime. The crimes that could lead you there covered a wide spectrum. At the high end was homicide, but on the more common and for our story more relevant end was the violation of forest law. Poaching a single deer from a royal forest was a capital offense. If you were caught, you faced mutilation or execution. If you fled into the woods to escape, you would be declared a wolf's head for your failure to stand trial. So a man like Robert Hod, our fugitive from Yorkshire, likely started with a debt or a poached deer, and his decision to run turned him from a suspect into a living target. The sentence was a form of social death. Upon being outlawed, you lost everything. Your property was forfeit to the crown. Your marriage was considered dissolved. You could no longer enter into any legal contract, buy or sell goods, or seek redress if you were wronged. Your family and community were legally compelled to shun you. Harboring an outlaw was itself a crime. You were cut off from the entire web of relationships that made a person human in the medieval world. This is the desperate reality that underpins any romantic tale of the Greenwood. The Merry Men were not a club of adventurous volunteers. They were a collection of the socially dead, men for whom every friendly face in a village was a potential informant. Every crack of a twig could be a posse, and every meal might be their last. Their laughter around the campfire, so celebrated in ballads, must have been edged with a constant primal fear. The legend gives us rebellion and camaraderie. The law gives us a stark picture of absolute vulnerability. This contrast is essential. It reminds us that the real people who inspired these stories were not choosing a life of swashbuckling freedom. They were choosing survival in its rawest form, trading the certain violence of the law for the uncertain mercy of the forest. The Greenwood was not a paradise. It was the only refuge left after the gates of society had been slammed shut and barred behind you. The sentence of outlawry stripped a man of his humanity, casting him into the wilderness as a beast to be hunted. But what if the Greenwood offered more than just a hiding place? What if it offered a different kind of identity, one that reaches back into a time before sheriffs and kings, into the deep roots of English folklore itself? To find it, we must step back from the court roles and into the realm of myth. There is a compelling theory that Robin Hood, the man in Lincoln Green, is not just a historical fugitive but the latest incarnation of a much older, primal figure, the Green Man. You have likely seen his face even if you do not know his name. He is the mysterious, leafy visage carved into the stone of medieval cathedrals, a face made of oak leaves and vines, sometimes laughing, sometimes solemn, sprouting from the very architecture. He is an ancient symbol of the wildwood, of untamed nature and the cyclical rebirth of spring. The connections to our outlaw are striking and impossible to ignore. Robin's defining color is green, the color of the forest canopy, of moss, of life itself. He is the king of the wildwood, appearing and disappearing among the trees like a spirit. And crucially, his earliest appearances in popular culture are intertwined with May Day, the great spring festival. In the 15th and 16th century May Games, a character called Robin Hood, often alongside Maid Marian, presided over the festivities. They were not outlaws in those plays, but figures of celebration, leading the dances and the revels that welcomed the return of fertility to the land. This Robin was less a social rebel and more a personification of the forest's vitality. This suggests a fascinating process of cultural layering. When Christianity spread across Britain, it did not simply erase the old pagan beliefs. Often it absorbed them, giving ancient spirits new names and new contexts. A local god of the hunt, a spirit who ensured the deer population thrived, or a deity of the oak tree revered by forest-dwelling communities could not be easily forgotten. Their stories persisted in folk memory. Over centuries, as these old myths met new realities, the powerful spirit of the wildwood might have been gradually reshaped. The supernatural guardian of the forest could evolve into a legendary human champion of the forest. The magical being who controlled the game became the superlative hunter who poached it. The divine protector of the people became the heroic outlaw who defended them. This is not to say there was never a real Robert Hod. Instead, it proposes that his name and his likely mundane story fell into a narrative mold that was already ancient and deeply powerful. The historical outlaw provided the skeleton, but the mythic Green Man gave the legend its soul, its timeless resonance, and its magical connection to the natural world. This fusion explains why the story feels so elemental. Robin Hood is not just fighting a sheriff, he is embodying the spirit of the wild place, resisting the ordered, controlled world of towns and laws. His conflict is older than taxes. It is the eternal tension between the cultivated field and the untamed forest. Recognizing this dimension does not disprove a historical core. It enriches our understanding of the legend's astounding endurance. It tells us that Robin Hood taps into something fundamental in the human psyche, a longing for the wild, a celebration of renewal, and a deep-seated belief that the natural world holds a justice of its own, one that sometimes wears a hood of green and carries a yew bow. The most vital clue in our entire investigation is not a grave or a court roll, but a story. It is a 15th century manuscript, a collection of ballads known as a Gest of Robin Hood. This is the oldest substantial text we have, and it offers a startlingly clear snapshot of the legend before centuries of polish and revision. Within its rhyming stanzas, we find a Robin Hood stripped of later aristocratic glamour, a figure who feels far closer to the gritty world of forest law and fugitive debtors. The plot of the Gest is a masterclass in medieval folk justice. It begins not with a grand rebellion, but with a very specific act of charity. A knight, Sir Richard at the Lee, is in dire straits. He owes £400 to a greedy abbot, and if he cannot pay, he will lose his lands. Hearing of this, Robin Hood loans him the money, no interest asked, requiring only that the knight return in a year to settle the debt. This is our first major clue about Robin's character. He is not robbing at random, he is targeting corrupt church officials and using the spoils to rescue a member of the lesser gentry from financial ruin. His enemy is not the king, but a specific exploitative system. The story then escalates. Robin famously ambushes the high cellarer of the abbey, taking his money, and later captures the hated Sheriff of Nottingham himself. He forces the sheriff to dine on his own stolen venison in the Greenwood, a delicious act of humiliation before letting him go with a warning. The final act sees King Edward, disguised as an abbot, traveling to the forest to meet this notorious outlaw. Impressed by Robin's loyalty and sense of fair play, the king reveals himself and pardons the entire band, inviting them to serve in his royal court. This narrative arc is packed with historical signposts. First, the geography. Robin's primary base throughout the Gest is not Sherwood but Barnesdale Forest in Yorkshire. He operates from a specific spot called the Sales, which historians believe refers to an area near Wentbridge, a known crossing point on the Great North Road. This firmly plants the earliest literary version of the hero in the north, not the Midlands. Second, the king is named as Edward. While this could refer to several monarchs, it most likely points to the reigns of Edward I, II, or III in the 13th and 14th centuries, a period when the ballads' concerns about law, debt, and royal justice were intensely relevant. Most importantly, the social dynamic is revealing. Robin is explicitly a yeoman, a free commoner of some standing but not a noble. His beneficiary, Sir Richard, is a knight but one of modest means, vulnerable to the predatory lending of a wealthy monastery. This shows the ballad's primary audience and concern. It is a story for and about the middling ranks of society, the lesser gentry and prosperous farmers who were squeezed between the powerful church and the crown's heavy-handed officials. Robin's conflict is hyper-local and personal. His primary enemy is the Sheriff of Nottingham, the embodiment of corrupt local authority, not the distant king. In fact, the king is portrayed as ultimately just, a figure who recognizes true merit and restores order. This Robin is not a revolutionary seeking to overthrow the state. He is a corrector of imbalances, a man who enforces a rough, woodland version of fairness when the official systems fail. The Gest presents him as a paradox, an outlaw who upholds a stricter moral code than the law itself. He is a hero born from the very specific anxieties of his time, a defender of the knight, the yeoman, and the smallholder against the twin threats of a greedy abbot and a vicious sheriff. In this oldest of tales, we are not watching a fairy tale, but a reflection of a deeply felt medieval reality. The sheriff's corruption was a local, tangible evil, but the legend's appetite for a grander foe was never fully satisfied. In the oldest ballads, Robin Hood's primary antagonist is always the Sheriff of Nottingham, a figure of immediate, visceral threat. He is the man who rides through your village with armed guards, who seizes your grain for taxes, and who hangs poachers from the nearest oak. His villainy is personal and administrative, rooted in the daily grind of injustice. Yet, as the centuries passed and the story reached for a wider, more national stage, this local tyrant was no longer enough. The enemy needed a crown. Enter Prince John. In the Victorian era and then cemented by Hollywood, the weak, treacherous brother of Richard the Lionheart was elevated from a shadowy background figure to the story's ultimate villain. This was a seismic shift. Suddenly, Robin's conflict was not with a corrupt official, but with a corrupt regent, a man who sat in the throne itself. This change served a powerful narrative purpose. It simplified a complex web of forest law and local grievances into a crystal-clear, morally unambiguous struggle. Good versus evil was no longer a yeoman against a sheriff. It became the spirit of England, embodied by Robin, against a usurping, cowardly prince. The sheriff became a mere lieutenant in this larger war. This reframing provided something the older stories lacked, a clean, royal resolution. In the new version, all the chaos and injustice is not the fault of a broken system, but of one bad apple at the very top. The solution, then, is not systemic change but the return of the rightful king. When Richard the Lionheart comes back from crusade, he pardons Robin, restores order, and banishes the wicked Prince John. It is a satisfying fairy tale ending that reinforces the idea of a just hierarchy. The king is good, his brother is bad, and once the good king returns, harmony is restored. This narrative is deeply comforting, and it served the political needs of the times. For Victorian Britain, a global empire with a beloved monarchy, stories that celebrated loyal subjects and a glorious, rightful king were ideal. It nationalized Robin Hood. He was no longer just a Yorkshire or Nottinghamshire folk hero, but a defender of the true England against a traitorous regent. Hollywood eagerly adopted this framework because it provided built-in drama, clear character roles, and a spectacular finale. Errol Flynn's Robin doesn't just outwit the sheriff, he humiliates Prince John in his own castle, all in the name of King Richard. This evolution sanitized the legend, smoothing its rough, rebellious edges. The early ballads are fundamentally about challenging local authority, about a common man holding power to account. By making Prince John the villain, the story subtly redirects that challenge. Robin is no longer opposing the structure of power itself, he is upholding its proper form. He is fighting for the king, not against the crown. This is why the change is so crucial to understanding the modern myth. It transformed Robin from a potentially radical figure, a man outside the law questioning its very foundations, into a conservative one, a loyalist working to restore the proper order. The enemy had to become royal for the hero to become a national patriot. A legend written in ballads and law rolls leaves no footprints in the earth. The search for physical proof of Robin Hood is an excavation of belief, not history, a journey to places where folklore has laid its own stones. Across England, the landscape is dotted with sites that bear his name, each a testament to the story's grip on the local imagination. In Sherwood Forest, visitors gather around the major oak, a vast, gnarled tree said to have been the outlaws' hideout. Its immense, hollow trunk could easily shelter a band of men. Yet dendrochronology, the science of tree ring dating, tells a humbling truth. The major oak is likely only around 800 to 1,000 years old, meaning it was a mere sapling, if it existed at all, in the 12th or 13th centuries. It became Robin's tree centuries after the fact, a natural monument adopted by a legend in need of a home. Up in Yorkshire, near the ancient forest of Barnsdale, you can find Robin Hood's Well. It is a simple stone structure marking a freshwater spring, a vital resource for any traveller, outlaw or otherwise, on the old Great North Road. Its naming is not a historical record, but a folk designation, a way for people to mark the landscape with a story they cherished. Then there is the grave at Kirklees Priory, the site of his legendary death. The current monument, an engraved stone slab, dates only to the 18th century, erected long after the priory itself fell into ruin. It marks a tradition, not a burial. These places are not evidence of a man, they are evidence of a memory. They show us where later generations, convinced of the legend's truth, went to pay their respects, to touch a tree, to drink from a well, and feel a connection to the myth. The dream of every enthusiast is to find something more concrete, perhaps the remains of a medieval outlaw camped deep in a forest. But this is where archaeology meets its limits. What would such a camp leave behind? The life of a fugitive was one of impermanence and poverty. A temporary shelter of branches and hides leaves no post holes. A hearth of a few stones, scattered by centuries of root growth and animal activity, becomes indistinguishable from a hunter's blind or a charcoal burner's pit. The artifacts would be meager and common: a lost iron arrowhead, a broken pottery shard from a stolen jug, a worn coin. These objects fill museum cases, but they whisper nothing of their owner's name or deeds. They are the silent possessions of the anonymous poor, not the calling cards of a legendary hero. This scarcity of proof is not a failure of the search, but a revelation about the nature of the story itself. Robin Hood was not a king who built castles or a bishop who commissioned tombs. If he existed, he lived on the margins, leaving the lightest possible imprint on the physical world. The real archaeology of Robin Hood is not buried in the soil, but embedded in the place names, the ballads, and the stubborn local traditions that refuse to die. The landscape itself became the canvas, and the people for centuries have been the painters, applying his name to the oldest oak, the most reliable spring, the loneliest grave. To look for his fort or his treasure hoard is to misunderstand him. His monument was never made of stone or timber, it was made of song, and it was built not in a forest clearing but in the collective heart of a nation. The song endures because it answers a deep, timeless human longing. We may live in a world of digital surveillance and complex bureaucracies, but the core fantasy Robin Hood represents is as potent today as it was in a medieval tavern. He is the ultimate archetype of the righteous rebel, a figure who channels our shared frustrations with systems that feel too big, too corrupt, or too indifferent to fight. Psychologically, he offers a fantasy of pure agency. In a world where many feel powerless against distant corporations, opaque governments, or rigid social hierarchies, Robin Hood acts. He sees an injustice, and with his own two hands and a band of loyal friends, he sets it right. He is not waiting for permission, for an election, or for a committee to deliberate. He embodies the wish to cut through red tape and deliver a swift, satisfying form of justice. This is why the archetype constantly reinvents itself in our modern stories. We see Robin Hood's echo in the smuggler with a heart of gold in Star Wars, in the hacker who exposes corporate secrets in a thriller, in the vigilante who cleans up a crime-ridden city when the police have failed. These characters all operate outside the official law, yet they claim a higher moral authority, and we cheer for them because they do what we often feel we cannot. This connects directly to the second pillar of his appeal, the redistribution of wealth. Economic inequality is not a medieval invention, it is a permanent feature of human society. The fantasy of taking from the obscenely rich and giving to the desperate poor is a powerful corrective to that enduring reality. It is a narrative of economic justice rendered in the simplest, most visceral terms. We see modern folk heroes celebrated for similar, though symbolic, acts. Think of the anonymous donor who pays off a school's lunch debt, or the modern-day pirate who hijacks a corporate stream to broadcast a political message. While their methods are different, the underlying impulse is the same: to correct a perceived imbalance, to shame the powerful, and to provide for the vulnerable. Robin Hood makes this impulse heroic, romantic, and effective. He does not just talk about inequality, he actively dismantles it, one loaded gold cart at a time. This fantasy resonates especially in times of economic anxiety, when the gap between the haves and have-nots feels particularly vast and unbridgeable by ordinary means. Finally, there is the powerful allure of the Greenwood itself, the dream of escaping to a life of freedom in nature. In an age of constant connectivity, crowded cities, and environmental concern, the idea of a community living sustainably and joyfully in the forest is profoundly attractive. The merry men are not just rebels, they are a chosen family, bound by loyalty rather than law, sharing food, laughter, and purpose under the open sky. This taps into a primal yearning for simplicity, for authenticity, and for a connection to the natural world that modern life often severs. The forest is not just a hiding place, it is an alternative society, one that operates on fairness, camaraderie, and respect for the land. This vision critiques the stress and alienation of our own world, offering a fantasy of returning to a simpler, more honest way of living, where your worth is measured by your skill and your character, not by your wealth or your job title. Robin Hood's timelessness, therefore, is no accident. He is not merely a historical curiosity, he is a mirror. In his defiance, we see our own desire to push back against oppressive forces. In his redistribution, we see our hunger for economic fairness. In his Greenwood refuge, we see our dream of a freer, more authentic life. The legend persists because the world, in its essentials, has not changed enough to make his story feel irrelevant. The sheriffs still ride out, the gold still gathers in distant towers, and the forest, both real and metaphorical, still calls to those who dream of a different way. England's Greenwood archer is not alone. From the snowy mountains of Slovakia to the sun-baked plains of Australia, cultures around the world have crafted their own versions of the righteous outlaw. This shared storytelling impulse reveals something profound about Robin Hood. He is not a solitary English invention, but a local expression of a universal human archetype. Take the story of Janosik from the Carpathian Mountains. In Slovak and Polish folklore, he is a near-perfect mirror, a former soldier turned bandit who robbed from the rich nobility and gave to the impoverished peasantry. He and his band operated from dense mountain forests, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to evade capture, much like Robin in Sherwood. His exploits are tales of clever trickery and bold defiance against the oppressive Hungarian landlords who ruled the region. And in a tragic parallel, his legend ends the same way, betrayed by a companion and executed. His story served as a folk heroic response to foreign domination and economic exploitation, a Slavic dream of justice from the highlands. Across the world, in feudal Japan, we find Ishikawa Goemon. While his methods were darker, often involving theft and assassination, he was immortalized in kabuki theater as a romantic rebel against the tyrannical warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi. The popular tale of his failed attempt to assassinate Hideyoshi and his subsequent execution by being boiled alive in a public cauldron cemented his status as a commoner who dared to challenge absolute power. Though less focused on redistribution, his legend channels the same spirit of daring resistance against a cruel and unaccountable ruler. Closer to our own time, Australia's Ned Kelly presents a more complex historical figure who was transformed into a legend. An Irish-Australian bushranger in the late 19th century, Kelly clashed with the colonial police, whom he saw as corrupt representatives of a biased English system. His homemade plate metal armor became an iconic symbol of makeshift defiance. While his actions were violent and his Robin Hood-like charity is debated, the ballads and public sentiment that grew around him after his execution cast him as a man fighting against the oppression of the squattocracy, the powerful land-owning class. In the public imagination, he became a rebel for the poor selector farmers against the wealthy establishment. What threads connect these disparate figures across centuries and continents? First, a clear, oppressive enemy, whether a foreign occupier, a greedy landlord, or a corrupt police force. Second, a mastery of the local landscape, using forests, mountains, or bushland as both refuge and strategic advantage. Third, a narrative of betrayal or capture that often ends in public, dramatic execution, sealing their martyrdom. And finally, a crucial layer of popular embellishment after their death, where songs and stories soften their rougher edges, amplify their generosity, and solidify their role as avengers for the powerless. This global chorus of outlaw heroes shows that the need for a Robin Hood is not bound by geography. Whenever power becomes too concentrated, too cruel, or too distant, the human imagination seems to conjure a figure who moves outside the law to restore a moral balance. England gave him a longbow and Lincoln green. Japan gave him ninja skills and a tragic end. Australia gave him iron armor and a defiant last stand. But the core fantasy remains unchanged, the dream that somewhere in the wild places beyond authority, a hero waits to tip the scales. So where does this leave our search for the real man? The evidence points not to a single archer waiting to be found, but to a magnificent cultural creation. There was almost certainly no lone historical Robin Hood who performed all the legendary deeds. Instead, the figure we know is a powerful composite, a folkloric archetype known to scholars as the social bandit. This archetype is like a vessel filled over centuries by the collective experiences, grievances, and dreams of ordinary people. The real Robert Hod of Yorkshire, a fugitive debtor, might have contributed his name. The ruthless, organized gangs like the Folvilles or Cotrells provided a model for the merry men and their methods. The universal hatred for men like Sheriff Philip Mark gave the legend its villain. The oppressive weight of forest law and the chaos of the Barons' Wars supplied the conflict, and hovering in the background, the ancient, leafy face of the Green Man infused the story with the timeless magic of the wildwood. The name Robin Hood acted as a powerful magnet. It attracted these disparate fragments of reality and bound them together with the glue of narrative. Whenever people spoke of a clever poacher who outwitted a forester, or a bandit who showed surprising courtesy to a poor traveler, or a fugitive who vanished into the trees like a ghost, that story could easily find its way to the growing legend. The name became a receptacle for every tale of resistance against overbearing authority. This process of myth-making is in itself the real story behind Robin Hood. It shows us how history is not just about kings and treaties, but about the silent hopes of those who lived under their rule. When official justice felt distant or corrupt, people crafted a hero who delivered a more immediate, satisfying version. When taxes were crushing, they dreamed of a man who ambushed the tax collector and returned the coin. When the forest, which should have been a communal resource, was locked away by royal decree, they imagined a king of that very greenwood who welcomed all. The legend is a historical document of popular desire. It tells us what medieval commoners feared, what they valued, and how they imagined justice might look if they could only seize it for themselves. The figure in Lincoln Green is far more than a man. He is a conversation across 8 centuries, a dialogue between a people and their power structures. He is the enduring echo of a question: what do you do when the world is unjust? And the answer, however fantastical, is that you take to the trees, you find your brothers, and you fight back. Our journey began with the dashing hero on the silver screen, but it led us into the dust of forgotten court rolls and the deep shadows of northern forests. We chased a ghost not through Sherwood, but through the wilds of Yorkshire and the chaotic politics of a kingdom in turmoil. The key takeaways are now clear. The legend of Robin Hood is far older and more northern than popular culture suggests, born not from a single man's life, but from the simmering grievances of an entire era. It is rooted in the very real, grinding conflicts between oppressive forest law and desperate people, between corrupt local officials and communities with nowhere else to turn. Yet over centuries, that gritty seed was embellished beyond all recognition, adorned with noble titles, royal villains, and a band of merry men who turned survival into a song. Perhaps then, this is the ultimate truth of our search. Robin Hood is more real and more powerful as a symbol than any single archer could ever have been. He is the eternal voice of the underdog, the embodiment of the hope that when systems fail, justice can still find a way, even if it must wear a hood and live among the trees. He belongs to everyone who has ever dreamed of balancing the scales. That is why his story will never die. It adapts because the need for it never fades. So we turn it over to you now. In the comments, we would love to hear about your favorite version of the legend. Was it a classic film, a modern retelling, or a local tale from your own corner of the world? Share the Robin Hood you carry with you. And if you enjoyed unraveling this historical mystery with us, subscribe to join the next journey into the past, where every legend has a story waiting to be told.